Today, for my final video presentation, I'm going to be talking about food insecurity. So, what is food insecurity? The definition can vary slightly from source to source, but to be food insecure is to have uncertain or limited access to nutritionally adequate and safe food. It's usually talked about in relation to the negative effects it can have on the health and development of children, but food insecurity affects adults as well. Long-term food insecurity and short-term food insecurity are often due to or worsened by certain circumstances like hurricanes, drought, and poverty. What has food insecurity looked like through time? It's a relatively recent term. Before agriculture, food was less guaranteed. The agricultural revolution allowed people to settle in, have excess food, and become healthier. However, hunger persisted even after this, even after people's lifespans became longer. Why? Because an increased food supply does not eliminate food insecurity alone. So, food insecurity occurs in all parts of the world. In the US, food insecurity really became a topic of importance in politics and culture after the Great Depression, when for the first time there was an abundance of food, but people were still going hungry. The government stepped in eventually and bought surplus wheat from farmers and donated it to the hungry. We started to get more welfare in the decades following, including SNAP and WIC, but today, US food insecurity is at an all-time high. This is partly due to the pandemic. The list of health outcomes related to food insecurity are quite long, but some are low birth weight, stunted growth, increased hospitalizations. It also puts a lot of stress on family units because it causes increased emotional and financial stress. Why should we be talking about food insecurity? The estimates of people who are food insecure are debated. This topic needs further research, but around 833 million people around the world are estimated to be food insecure, and in the US, food insecurity reaches more than 14% of households and more than 11 million children. Most often, the people affected are households led by single or immigrant mothers, or minorities, or falling below the poverty line. And as mentioned before, food insecurity is a global health issue that happens in developed and developing countries and in both resource-rich and resource-poor areas. This map is showing food insecurity percentages in different regions around the world. You can see that sub-Saharan Africa has higher rates of food insecurity. The article I'm going to be talking about today is Environmental Predictors of Stunting Among Children Under 5 in Somalia, cross-sectional studies from 2007 to 2010 from the BMC Public Health Journal. A direct quote from the article about its objective reads, "The aim of this study was to forecast the levels and patterns of childhood stunting in Somalia at a high spatial resolution using available survey data and standard environmental covariates. The goal is to improve interventions in the area, reduce food insecurity, and to do that, better forecasting tools are needed, as well as accurate estimates of stunting." They estimated stunting in Somalia from 2007 to 2010 and predict risk. They're looking for links between Somali children, which falls in the population vertex, rainfall and vegetation in the environment vertex, and undernourishment in the behavior vertex. This is a cross-sectional study. They compared children's proportions, household nutrition surveys, and environmental factors. In other words, they compared stunted and non-stunted children and determined their nourishment from survey results. And to predict future risks of stunting, they used a Bayesian hierarchical space-time model. that model was tested against a second model using all data for accuracy. This study takes place in Somalia. The country has 12 million people and 1.7 million children under 5 years old. Each year there are about 71,000 deaths under age 5. And the country experiences recurring drought, flooding, ongoing conflict, and so there is significant food insecurity and stunting, partly in result of the environmental factors and conflict. They used data from the Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Unit of the Food and Agriculture Organization. They had done biannual seasonal nutrition assessment surveys from the years 2007 to 2010, and they also received spatial coordinates for their data using online search, and verification of human dwellings were done through Google Earth. This table here summarizes the data that was used in the study. You can see the zones that the data is coming from, as well as the numbers of children stunted and percent stunted. The data was aggregated at cluster levels with corresponding environmental covariates and the survey year. These clusters had children examined, the stunted children, the environmental covariates, year, and season of each survey. The covariates were selected based on their association with vector-borne diseases and food security. The effects of the environmental covariates were determined by the Bayesian Information Criterion, and the Bayesian models were implemented to predict stunting prevalence on continuous maps. From their results, they determined that 31% of children in the study were stunted. For the environmental covariates that they tested, only precipitation and vegetation were positively associated with less stunting, which makes sense with droughts often resulting in food crises. So the two covariates that they used in the models are precipitation and vegetation. Overall, they found south-central Somalian zones had a higher prevalence of stunting, and vulnerable populations can be identified through changes in rainfall and vegetation. So on the left, we see line A shows the forecast model, line B is showing the model using all data. You can see the similarities between the forecast model and the other model, and you can see that it shares the accuracy. You can also note the higher prevalence of stunting in the darker green areas. And on the right map, you can see estimates of areas with prevalence over 40%. This was made using the excursion contour functions Model 1. These are the vulnerable populations, all in the south-central zone, in this dark green. These three graphs are showing the estimated proportions of children stunted by region and by year from both models. You can see the prevalence of stunting is continuously high in the south-central zones. In conclusion, the authors of the study stated that the stunting rate in Somalia is spatially and temporally heterogeneous. Rainfall and vegetation are drivers of variation. These environmental factors can aid stunting predictions, and results of the study can make interventions more efficient. They can show where they're most needed, where the vulnerable populations are, and their work has the potential to reduce food insecurity-related stunting and deaths under 5 years old. However, the study did have a couple of limitations. They used the World Health Organization population reference to measure stunting of children, which doesn't account for Somali children being on average smaller at birth, and Somali children typically follow pastoralist growth patterns where they are usually leaner and taller than other average populations. So the World Health Organization standards may underestimate stunting. There was also uncertainty of children's ages in the study. The reliance on mothers reporting in the surveys were unverified, and the conflict ongoing in Somalia worsens food insecurity, and it made it difficult to get reliable data. The unreliable data was excluded from the model, however.